Hey everyone, it's Jeff, and I'm back again for another great Roots screencast. And this time we're going to be talking about Roots configuration. So, I have created an example project, much like in the last video, just called example. And you should be familiar with some of this file structure. In the introduction video, we went over some of the views and some of the assets. In this video, we're going to be going over app.coffee and what exactly this is. So app.coffee is Roots' primary place to do configuration. As you might be able to see, this is a Node.js file. You can recognize this by the module exports and the requires up top. So let's break down what's happening here. Up top, we have a ignores key, which has a value of an array of various files and file matching patterns that are ignored from compilation. So first we have the README, which obviously we don't need to have in our public folder. We also have layouts, which are compiled into views, so they don't need to be compiled individually. Third is a convention that we sort of borrowed from Rails, which is that any file that starts with an underscore won't be compiled. So for example, you guys might have seen this settings file last time in the CSS folder. This settings file starts with an underscore because it doesn't need to be compiled on its own. It's just imported into the master file to provide some basic settings for colors and font stacks and things like this. After this is the gitignore, which of course we don't need in our public folder. And finally, ship.conf is a file that Roots will store your deploy access keys and information in for deployment, so that you don't need to type them in every time you deploy. This file you obviously don't want to ship out into your public site, and so that's just added to the ignores as well. Now, if there are any other files that you feel you would like to ignore from the compile, you can always check into the public folder and see what's in here to make sure that it's just the things that you need. You can add them to this array directly. If you just want it to match the file name, you can add the file name just like this, or a full path to it. You can also use this glob star syntax in order to match a pattern that can apply to multiple files. If you want to test out some of your pattern matching, you can go to globtester.com, which is a wonderful little utility that we made after using this glob syntax a little bit. The glob syntax, by the way, comes from a library called Minimatch, which is used frequently in Node. And you can put in your string here to test out whether it matches, as well as a few paths just to verify that you have created the right matcher. So this is a nice utility if you're trying to configure some more complex glob matched ignore patterns for Roots. And of course, this is also open source. This site was also built with Roots, and you can find the full code here if you find something that's wrong with it and you want to fix it up. Next, we have the extensions here. We're going to talk about these in a future video. Extensions are a big part of Roots, and they can get fairly complex. So we're just going to cover these in a separate video, and we're going to skip over them for now. After this, we have some options for stylus and CoffeeScript. Like you can see here, we are passing a couple of things into stylus. You can see up here at the top of the file, we are requiring all of these files in. So Axis Rupture and Auto Prefixer are all stylus libraries that can be used to enhance the behavior of stylus. We have these in here by default just because they provide a nice set of CSS defaults that you probably want to have available on all your sites. If you're not interested in these, or you want other ones to be added in, you are welcome to do so by simply installing the libraries through Node and adding them right to this use array. Also, you can see, as we discussed before, we have activated source maps so that everything is coming through, and the same deal with CoffeeScript. You can add compiler options for any language that you are compiling to the site. So if you are using EJS, for example, you can just add a EJS hash and pass any options that you want through to EJS. Now, you might be wondering, how do I know what exactly the options are that I can pass through and in what format they're passed? Well, let me introduce you to another tool. This one is called Accord, and Roots is built around Accord in the way that Accord does all of the compilation. and ensures that the interface for compiling languages is consistent across all languages and is entirely understandable for anyone that's looking at it. As you might know if you've worked with a number of compiled languages, the way that the author builds the languages can vary wildly. And so Accord is essentially a library that binds them all together, makes sure that the interfaces are consistent and well tested, and that's about it. So you can find and use this library entirely separate from Roots if you want. You might be starting to pick up on this concept after having seen Ship in the introduction video, but Roots really is not just one giant monolithic project. It's actually a combination of a bunch of smaller independent projects that can all be used on their own. So if you're not into Roots, you can always use any of these tools if you find any of their pieces of functionality useful. And in fact, Accord is in use in a number of different Gulp plugins just because it makes it easier and more consistent to pass options through. So if you go into Accord's documentation, you can see this is a list of all the languages that Accord will compile for you, and down here is stylus. So this will just go through each of the things you can pass through, as well as showing examples of how they might look and giving full descriptions of the type of data that you can pass in there. And you can see use is right here, and it takes an array of functions or just a single function if you are only passing in one. So there's that. Now, in order to show off how this works, I'm going to load up some of Jade's options. And you might have noticed when we looked at the source of a compiled site that it was all compressed by default. When Jade compiles, it will compress the outputted HTML into just one line by default. Sometimes in development, you want it to be pretty printed and indented the way that you would write it normally. So you can add the pretty option to Jade, setting that to true if you want it to pretty print your HTML. So what we're going to do is just run roots watch here to see how this comes out. And as soon as it compiles, we can check out the source and see that everything has been nicely pretty printed for us. Whereas if we were to turn this off and restart the watcher, as you do have to restart the watcher whenever you change app.coffee since you've changed Roots' configuration. If we view the source here, you can see everything's squashed onto one line. So it's very easy to customize each of your compiler's behaviors through Roots, and the interface just is super clear and makes plenty of sense. Just say the name of the language, and then you just pass in your object that contains keys and values for each of your options. And again, you can find documentation for all of this in Accord, where each language has its own file describing what kind of options can be passed in. Okay, so let's go over one more piece here. I want to talk about Roots' local server. So the server that Roots serves up your site at, you notice when you run Roots watch, it comes up at localhost and serves your files. It is called Charge. This is a server that we wrote that specialized in serving static sites, and it's got a bunch of nice useful options that makes serving static sites much easier. You can see that it is also broken down into a number of smaller modules if you'd like to explore any of those. But what's important here is that we can check out this options hash, and any of these can be passed in through your app.coffee to customize the behavior of Roots' local server. So let's say that we are watching our site and we make an about page. So I'm going to call this about.jade. Okay, looks pretty solid. If we go back to our site and then we go to /about.html, we should see welcome to the about page, which is exactly what we expected. Now, I would also like to just be able to go to about without the HTML and see our page. Unfortunately, I can't do that because it's serving up our site as it sees it. If we look in public, we can see about.html is here. So if you just put in about, it can't find a file called about since it's called about.html, and then it throws up the error. But we can customize the behavior such that it will also search for the file with the .html and if it finds that, serve it up. And so let's add that option in our app.coffee file. All we have to do to customize the server's behavior is add a server key here, and then we can add any of these options that are available here in charge. It just so happens for this one it's called clean URLs, which is something you could find elsewhere in the documentation for charge, but I didn't want to take you through the whole rabbit hole. So let's add clean URLs, set that to true, and as always when we've changed our config we'll just restart our watcher. And back over here we can now go to /about and we get the about page. We can also go to about.html if we want, and we still get that redirect back to the clean URL, which is just great. Before we go, let's just talk about one more option that you can add to app.coffee. I'm just going to go straight for this one. So if you add a locals key, any of the information that you pass in here will be made available to all of your views no matter what the language. So you don't have to pass it in through Jade. If you're using EJS, you don't have to pass it in through EJS. If you're using both, you don't have to pass it into both. Anything in locals will automatically be available to all of your views. So let's just add a little test value here. Now, I'm going to close these up for clarity. In our index file, we can just say, let's render the value of Doge here. And if we go back to index, we'll see nothing because we didn't restart. Take note. But if we do restart our watcher because we've changed the config file, you can see that the value here is wow, as we specified it. So this is another useful feature, especially if you are trying to pass through some sort of configuration information that you can either obtain more easily in this file or is repeated in a number of instances throughout your views and you don't want to copy and paste it. It's important to also note that if you're compiling your site in production mode, it will break if you're trying to rely on that value and it's not present in your production configuration file. So make sure that if you are going to ship this out, you want to also have that value here in your production file. Now the reason that they're not automatically copied over is because many times you might want to have a different value in development than you do in production. For example, if you are trying to insert a Google Analytics code, you might want to have a separate analytics panel for what your site looks like in development than your hits that you get in production so that your data isn't skewed. In this case, you can add that to the locals and make sure the value differs between your development app.coffee and your production app.coffee. Now this is just a small taste of what you can do with this app.coffee file. It's a very, very powerful and clean way to configure Roots projects. In order to see the full documentation for this configuration file, you can go to Roots' documentation and you can check out the configuration section. This section will show you a full description of any of the options that you can add to app.coffee, what the defaults are if they have defaults, and what you might be able to set them to and what they do. So if you're interested in this kind of thing, definitely check out the configuration docs and explore the different types of things that you can do with Roots. Thanks so much for your time and checking out this screencast. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.